Okay, so why Nietzsche is the greatest psychologist, and that's me saying it, and I am, as people know, an experimental psychologist and into experiments and everything. But I thought I would talk about him because he's actually what got me into the subject a long time ago. Why on earth do I have such a provocative title? It's because he spoke in those terms himself. So Ecce Homo, his autobiography at the end of his publishing life, had chapters like why I'm so clever, why I write such good books, why I'm so wise. And of course, Ecce Homo, as people would know, is a reference to Pontius Pilate, who spoke of those words of Jesus Christ. So, Ecce Homo, behold the man, that's what he's saying. Now, what did he say of himself? A psychologist without equal speaks from my writings. This is perhaps the first insight gained by a good reader. Who among the philosophers before me was in any way a psychologist? Before me simply was no psychology. So although he's seen as a philosopher, and he is a philosopher, he also claimed to be a psychologist as well. That's one of the book covers. I've chosen some book covers to illustrate this. So he was seeing himself as a psychologist. As we all know, the first psychological laboratory was being founded in Germany in the 1870s. So psychology as a science was occurring then. And he did all of these areas which are relevant to us as psychologists, the psychologists in the room and non-psychologists. You'll see these are his links to the psychologists. Individual differences between people, rank, as he called it, in other words, status, as we would call it, and something very dear to his heart. Psychodynamics, psychoanalysis and the unconscious, that's just one of the books that links Freud to psychoanalysis and psychodynamics and his influence on Freud and Jung. Evolutionary psychology, because he says that we are driven by our evolved drives. Social psychology, including cognitive dissonance, in other words, why we can believe things that we actually know aren't true. Political psychology, moral psychology, caveats about what's called self-actualization. We all want that to happen to everyone. He, in a way, was talking about that, but he doesn't think it'll happen to everyone. He's talking to a very few people. So some people see him as elitist, but Marxists take hold of him, libertarians take hold of him, conservatives, socialists, a whole load of others. And above all, aesthetics, which is why I played the music at the start. He was very much into aesthetics. And opera in particular. Now, just to mention science, according to Popper, because you're wondering why on earth we're saying Nietzsche's a psychologist, a scientist. According to Karl Popper, science has the rigorous testing of hypotheses and the generation of hypotheses through any means. And so what Nietzsche does is he provides us with the second of those. He's not in a laboratory. He is generating a whole load of hypotheses about people to explain our valuations and explain our behaviour. Quick biography. He was born in Saxony, Prussia, 1844. His father died soon after. Went to the leading Protestant boarding school. Then the University of Bonn and Leipzig to study philology, which is classics, but with an emphasis on the language used in classical periods of Greek and Roman and what the language used. On the basis of his undergraduate degree, he was so brilliant he was appointed Professor of Classical Philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland, 1869. He starts writing his books, resigns the chair due to ill health in 1879, hospitalised, as people may know, in 1889, and then died in Weimar in 1900. These are the list of his books. And as teenagers, we did love going around with his books, late teens, because they had such titles as Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, especially, and Human All Too Human. So they have very evocative, in-your-face titles, these books. Those are the order in which they were written. The intellectual background at the time, Christianity was obviously very strong, especially in Germany. And there was also scientific and very materialistic positivism. In other words, if you can't measure something, it doesn't exist. And there was a very strong materialist view of that. Now, he is a materialist, but he's not agreeing with those extreme ones. And so what he said was, in the face of these two things, if you wish to strive for peace of soul and pleasure, then believe. If you wish to be a devotee of truth, then inquire. So he wants people to be questioning. And he says that people, in response to the scientific and materialist positivists, we need two brains, a scientific brain and an artistic brain. And he was writing poetry and music, and he started as a teenager to write poetry. We still have lots of his poetry, and it's sometimes published with his books. The picture on the right is the opera house that Wagner set up in Bayreuth, and that was where he used to go some of the time. And that illustrates the fact that he wants people to have a scientific side and an artistic side, as he did. This is Wagner, the person he was extremely close to, the person who he thought would invigorate German culture and art with his operas. Tribschen in Switzerland is the middle place there. That's in Switzerland, so Wagner used to go there. Wagner was there when Cosima Wagner had her child Siegfried, so he was that close to the family. Lots of walks out with Cosima Wagner, Wagner's wife, and with Wagner himself. Wagner then moves to Bayreuth when he becomes very, very famous and very, very rich, partly because of the Bavarian king helping to fund him. And he's got that very, very grand house, which is now also a museum in Bayreuth. Now, I don't want you to read all of this, but this is going to illustrate his style of writing. He wrote in aphorisms. Aphorisms are short paragraphs, sometimes long paragraphs, but the idea is that they have a theme, and you can read just the paragraph on its own, just the aphorism on its own. That makes reading him very, very easy. It also makes misreading him very, very easy, because if you read an aphorism that says one thing, it may actually be contradicted by another one, and he's just making a rhetorical or extreme point. Now, this is the famous one called The Madman. And The Madman is in The Joyful Science, or The Gay Science, it's also been translated. And it's the story of the madman who goes into the square, starts arguing with people and saying God is dead. And they're agreeing with him. But he's saying, you don't understand how important this is and how the earth has been taken away from its sun. And so he's actually criticising the atheists of the time. And this is in a way why he's so different from Richard Dawkins now, who can say, yes, we'll have cultural Christianity. He's saying you can't have anything, or it's not clear what you will have. And so he writes in aphorisms like this. The Madman's very well worth reading. It then goes on. What festivals of atonement shall we have for killing God? And then he falls silent because people are just laughing at him. And he says, my time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way. Still wandering. It hasn't reached the ears of men. So people haven't realised the importance of their claim that there is no God anymore. He ends up being, as usual, quite flowery and poetic. What after all of these churches now, if they're not the tombs and sepulchres of God? So he writes in an extremely poetic and captivating way. So that's the God is dead. That's what a lot of people know about him. He's also quite witty. So this is a photograph of him, and the photograph he set up the photograph, and so it's not just some happenstance thing. My brain has gone. And Lou Salome is the woman who originally came from Russia, went around Europe with her mother, meeting lots of the philosophers and writers at the time, and was quite a sort of a femme fatale, lots of people falling in love with her because of her stridency and her strength. And so he sets this up with her as a whip. So he's a great wit a lot of the time. The person in the middle, Paul Razor, psychologist, or a proto-psychologist for the time. And I like the way that his eyes are looking to the side. So this is totally staged. That's the one thing to remember about that photo, famous photo. Now we can get an idea of what he believes with his views about Socrates. Now, as we know, for Socrates and Western civilization and world civilization is a complete hero, okay? Why was Socrates put to death? Corrupting the youth, thank you. Corrupting the youth of Athens. And the reason he was the way he's corrupting the youth of Athens was because he was going around arguing with people and getting them to justify their beliefs and things like this. And so he's an absolute hero. And so everybody loved Socrates, and so he was given hemlock to drink, and he refused to escape, he refused to run away, he took the hemlock, died. Nietzsche, however, says, Socrates' search for truth was the rejection of the artistic spirit. Was Socrates the corrupter of youth after all? Question mark. Did he deserve the hemlock? I mean, that's quite extreme. I'm not sure whether anybody had said that in Europe up until that point, but he's really not pleased with Socrates' rationality. And this shows the tension between what's called Apollonian and Dionysian values. And this is what Nietzsche, one of his major themes, and it's one of the major reasons why he loved Wagner and his operas and his music, was the tension between Apollonian value, which is order and reason, and Dionysian values, which are play, instinct, and also wine and festivals and drunkenness. And it's this conflict between the two of them that is productive creatively, that he hoped would be productive creatively in Germany at the time and across Europe. And he said that Socrates stopped it, or Socrates got in the way of all of this. There's a painting of the death of Socrates. And that's used in one of the famous books that Penguin Classics has got, The Last Days of Socrates, all the stories about this hero dying. He calls him a despotic logician. He says he was told in a dream to practice music, and he didn't want to. He said, "Have I been?" And so Nietzsche says of him, "Have I been too?" He could say, "Have I been too ready to view what was unintelligible to me as being devoid of meaning? Perhaps there's a realm of wisdom from which the logician is excluded." So he's really wanting people to be creative, artistic, and value that side of life as well, and saying that Socrates was wrong in that respect. Can't really use the word wrong. He doesn't really use the word wrong. This is what he had to do. Everything is, in a way, determined. Some people are going to end up as logicians, and you have to see what the downside of their logicianship is. As it says here, maybe he'd have said, perhaps art must be seen as a necessary complement of rational discourse. So what did he say of psychologists? If he's being horrible about Socrates, psychologists, he said, leisure is the beginning of all psychology. What? Could psychology be a vice? In other words, we've got so much time to think about other people's motives. It's a vice. We've got plenty of spare time. In fact, the book he wrote about that, where he says that, Twilight of the Idols, the initial title was A Psychologist's Idleness. It then got renamed Twilight of the Idols, playing on Wagner's opera Twilight of the Gods. The picture on the right is, of course, the Lazy Song. So I just thought that would be a link to idleness. So he then talks about what he calls psychologists' casuistry, in other words, bad faith arguments. He says, here we've got a connoisseur of humans who studies humans, but actually he wants to have an advantage over them by studying them. He's a politician. So he's talking about politicians. And then he says, we've got another connoisseur of humans over here who's impersonal. So for the psychologists in the room, that's us. We're being impersonal about our science, okay? Look closer. Perhaps he would like a worse advantage, to feel himself superior to humans, to have a prerogative to despise them, to avoid confusing himself with them. This impersonal one, psychologist, is a despiser of humans. The politician is a more humane species, in spite of appearances. At least the politician sees himself as an equal and wants to join in. It is a bit harsh, and I don't think it's true of me now, but when I think back to myself as a teenager, I did get into psychology because I wanted to know, why are people religious? Why are people going from why do people believe things? And I did want to do that, and I didn't despise them, but I knew that I was separate from them because I knew they were wrong. But I generously wanted to just understand, why do Moonies believe what they do. And I used to know Moonies quite well and go to their houses and go to their services. This is what I was spending my time doing. So the idea here is, for Nietzsche, our scientific curiosity, which may be a virtue, might have selfish origins. Now, the reason he did aphorisms is, he said, it's my ambition to say in 10 sentences what anyone else says in a book, what anyone else does not say in a book. And beware of the aphorisms because they're often playful, provocative. You may need context from other ones. The other reason to write in aphorisms is because he said, I mistrust all systematizers and avoid them. So he didn't like the Marxists and the socialists because they were seeing the world in class terms, they were systematizers, they had a systematic way of seeing the world. The will to a system is a lack of integrity, as he said. Very famous quote. Note also, however, you've read his biographies, he did have health reasons for writing aphorisms. He had lots of poor health, and writing aphorisms helped him to get stuff out there rather than to have to write in massive chapters, as is more normal. Now let's give examples of sceptical aphorisms. In The Joyful Science, he's got an aphorism there called What Gets Called Love. And that's the title. And then he goes on, avarice and love, how differently we perceive with each of these words. And yet it could be the same drive named twice. So your love for someone is an avarice. It is a possessiveness. So he's saying, skeptically, this is what this wonderful quality, virtue, might actually be at source. However, he then goes on to say, there is an ideal that stands above this. And that's friendship. So although he's being sceptical, and although on the internet you'll see a ton of sceptical comments from him, he often then uses the scepticism to come up with something that's really quite generous and positive and life-affirming. And I do a CF there is a tiny little quip aphorism he did at one point. Marriages don't fail due to lack of love, but due to lack of friendship. Now, that's not a sceptical statement, but he's coming out with a lot of sceptical statements to say, where are people coming from? What are their virtues really? And their virtues sometimes do not have a good background. Human All Too Human, for example, in that book, he wrote about how the idea of us having a soul and a body is due to dreaming. We dream of another world, and so we think that there is another world. There's a world of the souls. This is the source of all superstition and also probably the belief in God, he says. And then he says, the dead still live, for they appear to the living in dreams. So this is where this error of belief in the afterlife, belief in God, belief in superstitions comes from. He's trying to see where it's derived from. Now, Human All Too Human, that is a book that's very much to do with that. It's very much to do with saying, right, you've got a virtue? No, it's human, all too human. That's the reason for the title of the book. And he says about his writings, everything only? He wants an invitation to overturn our habitual valuations. And he says, what? Everything is only human, all too human? Everything we do that's virtuous? My writings, he says, have been called a school for suspicion or even for contempt. But happily, for courage as well, and even for audacity. Life has, after all, not been devised by morality. Life wants delusion. It lives upon delusion. So he's saying he wants to revalue things, and he's just sceptical about even people's virtues. He then says he invented a community of free spirits who did not exist because he needed their companionship. And he did get companions, so he did get people who very much loved him and loved his writings and who assisted him. He had a small number of people with him, and that's male and female. And he said he needed to do that so as to remain in good spirits among terrible things. And that's a reference both to his illnesses and also to the fact that he's coming up with ideas which are really quite terrible. Ecce Homo, his autobiography at the end of his life, he writes of this book, where you see ideal things, I see what is human, sadly only all too human. I know the human better. So this is the scepticism that he's coming up with on the path to get beyond that, to find new values. And the new values will come from our unconscious and from evolution. They throw these up. So we may have new values based on our new need for community or other type of values. So he's wanting new values to be arising because he wants to be what he called a Ja-Sagender, a yes-sayer for life and these values. He doesn't want to be this awful skeptic who... he doesn't want to be this awful skeptic that's just seen as a skeptic. His aim is saying yes to life, and we'll come on to that later. I'm just going to turn for example, all of us here, we may value curiosity, but he wants to show its roots and also its life-affirming nature. And the roots might not always be pretty for curiosity. We may have malevolent roots, egotistical roots for it. But is this initial skepticism rhetorical, or might it be empirical? Might it be testable? And this is where I'm directing this partially at the psychologist, because part of my thinking now is wondering how much of his ideas can be tested through experimental psychology and empirical psychology. And here we come to this young man who's written the book Troubled. Has anybody heard of Rob Henderson? So Rob Henderson spent his childhood in very, very adverse circumstances in California. Foster parents, bullying, abuse, everything. It was absolutely terrible. And if you read the book Troubled, it's a terrible autobiography in the sense of how awful his life will have been. Eventually, late teens, he joins the US military, does well in the military, gets promoted because he's really quite clever and diligent, and he ends up going to Yale. So he gets to Yale, and there's a lot of rich people at Yale, there's a very lot of well-off people at Yale, and there's a lot of white, well-off people who start telling him how privileged he is. And they start telling him things that they believe. And he's discombobulated about this because he's just arrived from an awful circumstances in California and saying, this isn't how we were seeing things there for life there. And he eventually started asking this question. Because some of them were saying defund the police, because he's been in situations where the police can actually be really quite helpful. But he has a lot of people, possibly some living in gated communities, nice parents, everything, who've never interacted with the police ever, saying we should defund the police. He's not agreeing with this. So he wrote an article, one of his articles is called What Do Top Hats and Defund the Police Have in Common? Because he can't quite understand, why do these people want to defund the police? And his answer is their luxury beliefs. So people in the past would have luxuries like wearing top hats or wearing winged collars that are white and need to be absolutely pressed perfectly, and this shows your status. This shows how better you are than the ordinary herd members. And he says these days, okay, a lot of people can buy a very posh car or something like that. They need another way of showing their status. They need another way of showing that they are part of the elite, and pretty much everyone at university is classed as that. How do they show that? And they do that by luxury beliefs. And these are beliefs which ordinary people would not hold, right? So that's part of the definition. Ordinary people would not hold them. But it's more than that. It's that if those beliefs were operationalised, ordinary people would be damaged. So ideas of absolute decriminalisation of drugs for everybody, he's saying, is a luxury belief. He's saying it's okay if you're in a gated community and you're not going to see bad effects of all of this. But if you have that belief, in order to set yourself off from the ordinary people, implementing that belief will actually hurt a lot of ordinary people. Defund the police will hurt a lot of ordinary people. So the definition of luxury beliefs is ideas held by privileged elite people that make them look good but actually harm the marginalised. So these people holding the beliefs may think they're doing the world a favour, but actually there's a lot of people who could be damaged by it. Now he's done a whole load of articles about this and his book about this. I see the one down there at the bottom right, How the Luxury Beliefs of an Educated Elite Erode Society. And there's another article in Wall Street Journal, Luxury Beliefs that only the privileged can afford. At Yale, I saw that extreme views on drugs, marriage and crime served as status symbols. So you can say marriage isn't important, I'm not going to, people can do what they want. I'm going to get married, but people can do what they want. And the promulgation of a whole load of beliefs, he's saying, can actually be quite socially destructive. But at least the people who have them are showing themselves as better than the underlings and can class themselves together with their similar elite compatriots. Now this has now been taken up by Musa Al-Gharbi, who's a sociologist, and he's written a book. So what we're doing is we're following on from Nietzsche's view that when people have particular views, those views might actually be held. They're not in bad faith because people believe the views, but there may be a level of cognitive dissonance here. The book is called We've Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. And I got hold of this because I saw a review which said this is Nietzsche, or this is a Nietzschean point of view. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I got hold of the book. In the inside of the cover, it says how a woke elite uses the new language of social justice to gain more power and status without helping the marginalised and disadvantaged. So the example he gives of the Occupy Wall Street, who say we are the 99%. And he says, yeah, you'll say we are the 99% because a lot of you are the top 10%. And you want to make sure you're okay in the top 10%. And you want to put all the blame on the top 1% when you're actually part of the problem yourself. Now, Freud and Nietzsche would very much approve of this. Freud would approve because he'd say, why do you have this view? And he'd link it to someone's childhood or something like that. Nietzsche is saying, yes, you've got this view in the search for status. It's not actually helping the people who you think are going to be helped by it. The reason Musa Al-Gharbi says this is occurring so much, because it wouldn't normally occur, there's no reason why a whole load of people would do this. He says we've got elite overproduction. Society produces too many people who feel entitled to high status and high incomes relative to the capacity of that society to actually absorb those elite aspirants into the power structure. Under these circumstances, growing numbers of frustrated erstwhile elites grow bitter toward the prevailing order and try to form alliances with genuinely marginalised populations in order to depose the existing elites and install themselves in their stead. And I just remember myself in my early 20s and teens going on these anarchist marches. We wanted to get rid of the hierarchy, and we wanted to get rid of master-servant, everything like that, get rid of the hierarchy. And you do wonder whether or not the issue we had was we just wanted to be the ones who were at the top. And the problem wasn't that there's a top. The problem was we weren't there. He's even done an MA. I got hold of his MA, which is online. And this is brilliant. This is called Building on Nietzsche's Prelude. And it's actually about epistemology. It's about how you know what you know. And he takes a Nietzschean view, which is you know what you know because your unconscious tells you it. Your unconscious agrees with it. If someone asks you why you know, you give reasons. But you don't give the reasons haven't led you to it. It's not your consciousness, it's your unconscious and your drives, and a lot of those have quite negative aspects to them. We don't act on reasons. Instead, we produce reasons when useful for justifying ourselves. That's his MA, so I was really quite impressed by that. But anyway, interesting guy, so he's a sociologist. And he links, obviously, to classic psychology papers, such as this one, Telling More Than We Can Know, which says that we often don't know why we're reasoning as we're reasoning. We don't have introspective access to a lot of our reasoning. Now, this leads on to will to power. This is will to power over not merely a desire for power over us others, but rather a broader and deeper striving for self-affirmation, self-overcoming, and the realization of one's potential. He says, only where life is, there is also will. It's not will to life. We won't keep alive at any circumstance. That's not what we want to do. It's will to power. The living creature values many things higher than life itself. But out of this evaluation itself speaks the will to power. And one of the issues that I want to address is how could we ever measure this? But I can see what he means. And I know he's coming to this from the point of view of someone who's often ill, and resurgence comes out of it and is then powerful, goes back in. I can see that. I can see the physiological basis. And he says philosophers, individual philosophies, is nothing other than the biography of the philosopher. So if you could apply that to him, that will to power is partially to do with the fact that he was going through periods of weakness, illness, and severe illness as well. But anyway, whether or not we can measure will to power is another issue. And then he says, in the Antichrist, what is good? Everything that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in humans. What's bad? All that stems from weakness. What's happiness? The feeling that power is growing, that a resistance is being overcome. Not contentment, not virtue, but proficiency. So it's strong stuff. But at the same time, he's got his artistic side and everything like that. And that's why there's a Woody Allen joke in one of his films where somebody's going to a psychoanalyst and they're talking about it and says, I'm going to a psychoanalyst now, I'm going to this Nietzschean psychoanalyst. And of course the joke is, if you're watching the film, you're going to be bossed around and kicked around and told you're useless and things like that. And which is funny for a film, but it's a bit unfair. Nietzsche is saying this type of things, but he's also got his highly attuned, sensitive side to him as well. But that's will to power. Next thing that's very important for him is master and slave morality, because he believes that a lot of the history of humankind is the history of people who are obedient, have to be obedient often, and people who are giving orders. So I just started off with this one. Today, as always, men fall into two groups, slaves and free men. Whoever does not have 2/3 of his day for himself is a slave, whatever he may be, a statesman, a businessman, an official, or a scholar, unpublished. So slaves is meant very broadly drawn, even the people who have to work 8 hours a day, he's classing as that. And so he looks into history and says that what's happened in history is there's been some people who could requite good with good, evil with evil. They're able to be grateful or vengeful to other people. Whoever is powerless and cannot engage in requital is called by them bad. So at the time of, he's writing often about classical times, people at the time in one group, say Athens or whatever, they would not see a rival city as bad. It would just be, because they are equally noble as themselves. One does not regard one's enemy as evil, is his view there. So that's human all too human. Kaufmann, who's one of the major biographers of Nietzsche and who in 1950s wrote a book, Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist, which very much resurrected Nietzsche's reputation in the Western world and around the world. He said that master morality is present in the Iliad and slave morality in the New Testament. And Nietzsche's not in a way saying that either of these is good or better. You wouldn't like to be a slave, and being a master isn't necessarily wonderful, as I'll come on to in a moment. He's just describing genealogy. He's describing how he sees the past. And he says later, societies and individuals will combine master and slave morality. Nietzsche's point is the genealogy of these two moralities. Their interaction leads to psychologizing, assessing motivation. Because the blonde beasts, as he put it, these are people who just have no regard for morality, they do what they want. The blonde beasts never had to bother with that. So you don't get psychologizing and thoughtful motivation and thinking about motivations from the blonde beasts. The blonde beasts, by the way, is entirely metaphorical. He counts as blonde beasts Japanese warriors and Indian higher caste warriors. So it's a metaphorical term for the people who just need to have no consideration for other people, and their wants are what is prioritized. Now, the opposite of power is resentment, and this can be led by the priests. And what he says is that Rome was defeated with all of its good values, and Greece and Rome was defeated by Jesus, Peter and Paul the apostles, and Mary, mother of Jesus. The priests win, he said, and we get an obsession with motives and psychologizing. But in a way, that's a good thing, don't forget. And so, for example, Jesus' comment about, if you have adultery in your heart, you've committed adultery. He's pointing out, yes, look, this is now starting to say it's what is in the mind that matters, and can lead to resentment by those who see other people as stronger, happier, healthier, whatever. So resentment is a major driving force for humanity, Nietzsche says, and the problem is that resentment can sometimes overturn very useful values by the people not living up to those values. So he wrote in the book Genealogy of Morals, he's got a parable. He says, come with me, look into this dark workshop where ideals are fabricated. And he says, weakness is lied into merit. Impotence and not retaliating is changed into kindness. Anxious baseness into humility. Subjugation into obedience. Having to wait into patience. Not wanting to avenge into forgiveness. So you can see he's not too happy with some aspects of Christianity and thinking that there is weakness there as amongst some of its people. This leads to the mind and the body issue. Christianity prioritizes the mind and the soul, Descartes the mind and reason. And what he wrote about was that actually what you've got is your body. Your body acts maybe illogically and unjustly, but there are struggles between the drives in the body. And so rapidly and furtively does this mechanism now play itself out in us, that we don't know what the body is doing. Now, he expanded on that in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra was the founder of Zoroastrianism, the first sort of monotheistic religion. And so he thought, right, he's going to be the hero of this book because he will announce what the next stage of human evolution is now that God is no longer with us. Mankind is a bridge to the Superman, he said. And in there he has a chapter on the despisers of the body. I am body and soul, so speaks the child, he said. And why should one not speak like children? But the awakened, the enlightened man says, I am body entirely. So what he says is, your body has all of this multiplicity of drives, and your body is the self. So let me just find the body's the self so I don't get onto that. So I just want to get the exact quote, sorry. So the self, the basic thing is the self is the body. That's his thing. The self is your physiology. So what of consciousness? So he says consciousness is there. We could do without consciousness. Now that is actually a common view in some philosophy of consciousness. There's a famous zombie argument that's been put forward by Dennett, saying, well, maybe we could just do without consciousness and we talk and it's discussed and it's sort of processed, but without the need for this experience at the same time. And so what he says is that actually what you have is experience and make-believe. The consciousness gives you make-believe. Your self is your body. And he says our so-called consciousness is a more or less fantastical commentary on an unknown, perhaps unknowable, felt text. So in other words, we're trying to work out what all these drives are making us do, but they're unconscious. And our consciousness, our account of ourselves, is actually just a fantastical commentary. It may have no relationship to reality at all for why you actually do what you do. The body is the self, everything else is make-believe. And he gives an example of doing something spontaneously and saying, if I had to think about it too much, everything would have been different. To experience is to make-believe. So why are we conscious at all? He says we're conscious in order to communicate with other people, and especially between commanders and obeyers. But there's no necessary truth in what we're saying to each other. These are just the rationalizations and rationales that we give above. This leads to the eternal recurrence. I'd best not read all of this out, but you can find it in The Joyful Science. And what happens is he imagines a demon comes to you and says, everything that happens to you will recur again and again and again. You will have your life again and again and again. And he says everything that's happened, every minor thing will happen and recur again and again. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned over again and again, and you along with it, tiniest speck of dust. If you were told this, would you throw yourself to the floor and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke like this? Or would you want that and say you're a god? And he says how fond you would have to become of yourself and of life to crave nothing more than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal. So he's saying, what are you in the position in life to want everything that you've ever had simply recurring forever? And he says, my formula for greatness in humans is amor fati. That's love of fate. That you wish for nothing different. So nothing different in what's happened in your life. Neither in the future, nor in the past, nor in the eternity. And not just bearing it all for necessity, but loving it. Loving your fate, loving what's happened. Now, it sounds completely unempathic because a lot of people have really quite awful lives. But he also had quite an awful life, so I can understand it. But he's also saying there may be a view, and maybe anybody here who's psychotherapeutically trained, it might be something to discuss with you later. He's putting up the idea that if people believe in everything had to happen, or I accept everything as it has happened, that may be a way of greatly appreciating life. Amor fati, love of one's fate. And the subtitle of Ecce Homo is How to Become What One Is. So it's the idea that you have a fate. And Jung took that up. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And similar to that, he also said, Jung, the person you fall in love with, this is your life partner, that person was already there in your unconscious. So it's the idea that who you fall in love with, it's not just chance. There's something there that was determined. Okay, so those are lots of his views. Those views now come into prominence with one particular matter, which is a whole sections of Beyond Good and Evil, particularly in the section on peoples and fatherlands. And I'm just going to ask whether anybody knows, if you could just put up your hand so that anybody who doesn't know can think about it. Who is he talking about when he says the strongest, most tenacious and purest race? Anybody know who he's talking about? People don't know, you could guess. The strongest, most tenacious and purest race. And it's the one race who he says deserve from him and fellow artists gratitude. The Greeks. Good idea, but no. Not the Greeks, but a good idea. So, I thought someone might say Germans, but absolutely not, according to him. So that wouldn't be true. He's deserved gratitude.
By who?
By artists, him and artists. It'd be just very interesting if people don't. I assume some of our people from humanities will know, but. Pardon?
Romans?
No. Well done. Thank you very much. The Jews. He said they show the highest resilience and achievement. This group have the highest resilience and achievement. When you think of the number of colonizers they've had, vast number, including the British, what have the Romans done for us, all that, and their high level of achievements, his response to them is gratitude. And from what we've seen so far of him valuing strength, he really doesn't like the anti-Semites. And he says they are weak, and that's the reason why they dislike the Jews. He says of the anti-Semites, because there are a lot of them in Germany, and unfortunately his sister married a very prominent one, he said it would perhaps be useful and fair to expel the anti-Semitic schemers from the country. So he's really down on them, and he names the two worst groups in the world for resentment. They are the anarchists and the anti-Semites. So it's very, very interesting. That's Marc Chagall, painting Rabbi with Torah scroll. So just to mention, because I'm off to Vienna in a couple of days, and these are pictures of Jews being forced to scrub the pavement. And the last time I was there, I was with a American who spoke with a European accent. He was very elderly, and he said, last time I was here with my family, and we were being forced to scrub the floor. And so he'd managed to emigrate, joined the US military, and helped to put an end to that. But what he says is very prescient. The whole problem, so-called problem of the Jews, exists only within nation states, since it's here that their energy and higher intelligence, the accumulated capital of spirit that they are built up from generation to generation in a long school of suffering, must reach a degree of preponderance where it awakens envy and hatred. So that in almost every existing nation, especially those behaving nationalistically, this incivility leads the Jews to the slaughterhouse as scapegoats for every possible public and personal misfortune. This leads them to the slaughterhouse as scapegoats for every possible public and personal misfortune gains the upper hand. So treating them as scapegoats gains the upper hand. Now, one of the reasons he broke with Wagner started doing Christian-style operas, or one in particular. That upset him. Wagner started getting very nationalistic, but also Wagner was very, very anti-Semitic. So I showed a picture earlier on of Bayreuth, the opera house that Wagner built. In the hill coming down from that towards the entrance to the opera house, there are now large monuments to a very large number of Jews who in the early part of the 20th century had been part of building up the opera company there, composers and everything like that. So people can read those. There's many rows of those. So I will finish by talking about just mention a few myths. Some people say he went mad due to syphilis. No, we're almost certain he went mad due to codicil, which is a neurological illness which causes migraines and sight problems from a young age. He had it from a young age, and it's almost certain it wasn't syphilis, which kills people a lot quicker. It probably isn't true, the story of the Turin horse. There's a story that he saw a horse being beaten in the street in Turin, and he rushed up to it and put his arms round it. It's actually quite believable when you read his biography that he would do such a thing, but that story is also in Dostoevsky, and so although people have used that to sort of explain his descent into madness, that doesn't seem to be true. Nationalism. He was a stretcher bearer in the Franco-Prussian War, saw the horrors of war before returning to stay with Wagner in Switzerland, and this really turned him off nationalism. That partly led to the break with Wagner, who was being started to be lauded in German nationalist circles, while Nietzsche was praising the need to be a good European, as he put it. He also broke, as I said earlier, with Wagner due to Wagner's extreme anti-Semitism. He was even writing books in hatred of the Jews. This anti-nationalism was covered up by his sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, after his death. And she made out as if he was a German nationalist. And she produced a book called The Will to Power by editing his notebooks and putting in things into there, some of which were then picked up by German nationalists and unfortunately by the Nazis after that. So that book, The Will to Power, is a little bit discredited, and thankfully now that we've got the full volume of Nietzsche's works, his notebooks are all within there, so there's not really any reason to read that book, which is not actually by him or authorised by him. So Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, a bit of a malevolent influence. What am I going to do now? I'm going to co-write a book, I hope, on the relationship of Nietzsche's ideas to empirical psychology, because I do think it's possible to address some of his theories in empirical psychology points of view. So if anybody has any ideas there, please let me know. There's books such as this one, Nietzsche and Psychology and Psychotherapy, but it's all about his work. It's all about what he says about psychology. So it's not at all a interface with empirical psychology. The second thing to do, and I got this idea by going to Nice, where he went and got invigorated in Nice. And he wrote there was an earthquake in Nice. This is the first house he stayed at in Nice and got invigorated for his writing. And he was in the middle of an earthquake there. And the whole population camps at the moment outdoors, he said. The house in which two of my works were conceived was so shaken that it was necessary to destroy it. It will be an advantage for posterity to have one pilgrimage less to make, which I thought was a very Nietzschean thing to say, that, the house he stayed has gone one pilgrimage less. But it did give me the idea that there isn't actually a guidebook of all the places that he went to all around Europe. And so mixing up his psychology, his love for art, and a guidebook which shows places he was at and places you could visit might be a good idea. So I've sent that to Routledge, and they've said, send us back a full sort of book spec for what you would do, and we'll let you know. So that's a hopeful thing there. And thank you. So thank you very much.